Hello. In today's video I'm answering the question, does the Bible teach that women should be silent in the church? I'm commenting on 1 Timothy chapters 1 and 2, more about the chapter 2. First we should understand the topic. What is the author writing about on chapters 1 and 2? Just see some of the hints in those chapters. He's talking about false masters, false ministers, the kingship of Christ, and a defense of his own apostleship. So there is no indication that 1 Timothy chapter 2 talks about worship. The origins of the misinterpretation that 1 Timothy chapter 2 is talking about worship comes from Augustine, when he makes a relation between the expressions prayer, intercession, thanksgiving on the verse 1 with the liturgy of the Mass. So he understood this sequence as being what we today call a Roman Catholic liturgy of Mass, because of the relation between the giving thanks, in Greek Eucharistos, and the idea, the association that these words would always be equal to the communion service. What we should keep in our minds is that chapter 1 is talking about ministry and kings, and chapter 2 is a continuation of this. Paul is still talking about magistrates, this name that's a common name for kings, governors, rulers, ministers, apostles. He's still talking about the same thing, about how you get good magistrates that will help the Christian cause, that will end up the persecution that they were suffering on Roman Empire, and how you get rid of bad ones that will increase the persecution. And how you do this? You get rid of bad magistrates, you got new good magistrates on the church, on the state, by the process of election. And we have this word election, suffrage, used on the first verse to the ancient French editions of the Bible. Therefore, we can understand that this is not about a worship meeting, but an election meeting. We have a specific expression on 1 Timothy chapter 2, lifting up of holy hands. And this lift up of hands in Greek is the expression kero. And we have this expression for hands, kero, being lifted, kerotone, on Acts of the Apostles 14:23. And it's very clear on Acts of the Apostles. What's happening there is the election of a minister. On 2 Corinthians 8:19, the same expression is used to point the election of a person that will represent the church by traveling. The same word shows again on Timothy and on Titus. This expression, the raising up of hands, is the election, the choosing of a representing person. When we study the Bible, we have to ask the proper questions. Who wrote the text? To whom the person wrote? And what's the topic the text is talking about? And we have to respect this investigation of context when we are understanding what the text is talking about. Who wrote the letter? The Apostle Paul. So that letter would be taken by Timothy. Timothy would read this letter and apply it to the churches. What we know about Timothy? He is part Gentile, part Jew. He receives the Hellenistic culture and he receives the Jewish culture. And those churches he was going into are churches that are also divided between these two heritages, the Hellenistic heritages and the Jewish heritage. So those churches, they were organized in a specific way politically. How this culture between Hellenistic culture and Jewish culture organized itself. Usually we have the woman administrating the households. They were responsible for running family business and taking care of everything that was related to the estate and to the servants. And the men outside working into war, external politics, and studying the Bible. We see a very similar structure today in the Ashkenazi Jews that live on present times Israel. Of course, there were exceptions to this. There were men that had no wives, running their own servants and estates and family business. There were women without husbands that were doing both things, the household and the external affairs. Other exceptions would include when husband or wife had specific callings or specific connections in the external world. So there were exceptions. It was not a monolithic society, but mainly what we have is women running the households. In this structure, it was the responsibility of the woman to discover the will of the household, to talk and to interview and to guide the taskmasters, the main servants, the children, and discover what was the political will of the household, whom the household was voting for, minister or civil magistrates. The role of man on that society was to make the decision of the households that was communicated to him by the woman something that was public. The kind of meetings that Paul was describing here is when every husband or every male representative of the household is making public the will of the household that was discovered by the woman. So, should women be silent in the churches? The answer is no. The text is talking about a procedure, a decorum of an election process. And in this election process, there is simply an organization of who do what in which time. Men should stand up and make known the will of the household, the vote of the household. The women that got these results by the politics of the in-households should stay and wait for the man to make this will publicly known. The word here we have in Greek, hysukia, is a political word that means stay on your place, seated, and wait. So what we have is this: the men stand up and make public the will of the household. The woman that already got the will of the household from her in-household political role stays seated and waiting for the man to make this will publicly. So the other question that comes up from this text is, should women be allowed to cheat on the church? And the text is not talking about this. The text is talking about what starts with men on the verse 8. when you are voting, when you are raising up your hands, raise up your hands in a holy manner, without disputations, without getting into heated discussions about the politics, about your candidate winning or losing, and why your candidate is better than the other. Just stand up and vote. That's what we have for men on the verse 8, without wrath, without factions. And it's the same thing here when he's talking about women. Do not stand up to defend your candidate, why this guy should be a better pastor, what that guy should be a better ruler. Do not stand up to say, oh, my husband just stole the vote of my household and he's lying, the will of my household was another. Just it's not the time for discussion. It's just for people to be silent and the men to stand up and show the vote of each household. So it has nothing to do with teaching. And if there is some kind of if there's something that's going wrong, if the man is lying about the will of the household or anything like this is happening, that should be resolved outside of the meeting, not in the meeting. That's why the Greek word chosen to this verse is the one that usually refers to husbands, not the more generic words about teaching men. This verse has nothing to do with allowing or forbidding women to teach men in the church or in any other situation. Paul is just saying, do not cause a public dispute with your husband on this votation meeting. And why Paul says this? Because there was some kind of disruption on this process of election on that churches. And he wanted to solve this without changing their culture or how the election were being executed on those churches. This has nothing to do with Paul condoning this kind of meeting or making this kind of meeting or this structure or this role for man or this role for woman in some kind of commandment. This has nothing to do with us, unless you're living in a culture that's similar to that. Of course, we are not throwing away this holy chapter because it belongs to another culture. We should look for the moral of the story. And the moral of the story is, do not have factions, and especially political factions. Do not fight for power, but just take care of things so you can live peacefully and quietly your good and happy common life. Thank you for watching. See you next time.